No, let's go back. All right, everyone.
We might just get everyone online to turn their microphones off. There's a bit of.
Oh, really? There is a.
If someone online said that.
Yeah, I'm just gonna mute everyone.
Yeah.
Emma, do you want to introduce?
Yeah, I will. No worry. Okay. All right, everyone. So welcome back to another installment of the UQ Philosophy Seminar. And on this occasion, we have the pleasure of having Calvin Normore, who is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. And Calvin, of course, he's from there, but he's a local in reality because he spends a lot of time here at UQ. And it's the first time he has spoken at the seminar for a while, right? I think.
Many years, yeah.
There you go. And then he will talk to us about truth and normativity. So please, Calvin.
Thanks very much, Guillermo. Yes, I'm an honorary professor here, in fact, and I'm very pleased to be one. Okay, so the technology may be a bit tricky. Let me see if I've understood how everything works here. So the title that I have up here is Truth and Normativity, and I'm only going to get a little bit towards normativity and not all that far towards truth, but let's see how far it goes at any rate. Okay, and we'll see if it all can be done. Okay, let me see first of all how to advance the screen here.
Click the mouse, click on the stuff.
Just click with the mouse. Okay, got it. Okay, all right. So first, right, here's the opening of Francis Bacon's essay on truth, right, which begins his Essays in Council. What is truth, said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer, says Bacon. And if Pontius Pilate really didn't stay for an answer to his question, what is truth, he was definitely out of step with the philosophy of his day, and indeed of much philosophy since, right? The question had been the subject of serious discussion for some centuries before, and it has remained so. Okay, let's see if this works. Yeah. So as far as I can see, there are at least 5 issues that a theory of truth has to face. One of them is just, what is truth? A second one is, what are the truth bearers? A third is, are there cases in which items which would ordinarily bear truth or falsehood or some other value, if there is one, do not? For example, cases of future contingents. And then there are the various kinds of paradoxes that seem to emerge when one thinks about truth, paradoxes which have led actually some to think that the concept is undefinable, for example. And then there's the normative question. What do we care about truth, and why? Why should we care about it? Okay. So if we confine ourselves to the first of those issues, what truth is, we'll find in the current literature a rather restricted palette of cases. Okay, let me just take this off. Actually, if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is just bring up my own text here. It's going to take a second to do it. That's all. No worries. I'm more used to working from the screen anyway, so it's all fine for me. Okay, so for example, if we look at the SEP article on truth, we'll find that it only lists 3 accounts of what truth might be, right? Right. The noun truth can be used to refer to the concept that picks out the property. The noun truth can be used to refer to the general relational property, otherwise being referred to as being true. And finally, it can be used to refer to some set of truth bearers, right? As in, Martin says, the truth is out there, or the truth about this matter will never be known. And it's interesting that he thinks that that is a reference to a class of truth bearers. So my hope is to focus eventually on an issue that's strikingly absent from this list, but strikingly pervasive in the history of philosophy, the normative character of truth. Now, I might not get very far with that today, but I hope at least to begin with William James, who writes, and here's what he says: "The truth is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief, and good too for definite assignable reasons." And that's in the introduction to pragmatism. And then he goes on to say, let's see if this comes up: "The true, to put it very briefly, is only the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving. Expedient in almost any fashion, and expedient in the long run, and on the whole, of course." Now, James identifies the good with the expedient, but I suggest that we resist that move. As my colleague Pamela Hieronymi has suggested, in fact stressed, expediency, no matter how minded, is not a suitable reason for belief, precisely because it doesn't bear on truth. If a mugger with a gun to your head threatens to kill you if you don't hand over your wallet, you certainly have a reason to hand it over. But if they threaten to kill you unless you believe that 2 + 2 is 5, you have a reason to pretend, and even a reason to study arguments for the inconsistency of arithmetic, shades of Pascal's wager, but not a reason for a belief that 2 + 2 is 5. You might have a reason for a believing that 2 + 2 is 5, but it's not a reason for the belief that 2 + 2 is 5. It is, as Pamela suggests, the wrong kind of reason. Right? So here's Pamela. "Suppose that your life depends on your ability to give convincing testimony that the butler did it, but you don't believe he did, and you're a terrible liar. Now, you might believe that you have overwhelming reason showing it good to believe the butler did it. It would save your life. Yet the fact that you take these reasons to be fully convincing does not itself show that you believe the butler did it, because it doesn't show that you've settled the question whether he did." Right? You're convinced that you have good reasons for believing it, but you're not convinced in such a way that you believe it, right? Rather, by finding these reasons convincing, you've settled the question on which those reasons actually bear, namely the question of whether it would be good to believe that the butler did it. And thus, by finding these reasons convincing, you form a second-order belief about the belief that the butler did it. You believe it would be good to believe he did it, and you might also desire to believe it. You might intend to bring it about that you believe it. But since finding these reasons convincing implies nothing about whether you have the belief of which they count in favor, Pamela, calls them extrinsic, right? And you can see that there's a difference then between having reasons for believing something and having reasons for the belief. But what though of the claim that the true is the good by way of belief, right? We need to decide whether being good in the way of belief is a way of being good. After all, a good thief is not thereby good, right? Suppose that we charitably take James and Richard Rorty, for example, after him, to have intended to say that where belief is concerned, the true is the good, and that a belief is a true belief if and only if it is a good belief. Now, what are we to make of that? Okay, so that brings me to the question, what is truth, right? So James said that the true is the good in the way of belief. He didn't quite say that truth is the good in the way of belief. Though, for example, Michael Lynch in the APO back in October 2020 have said that that's what he said, right? He said, the true is the good in the way of belief, not truth is the good in the way of belief. Now, what does this matter? Why should this distinction between the true and truth matter at all? Well, as one has to do with these days, because it's the most reliable method, I asked Anthropic Claude. And here's what Anthropic Claude told me. It said, truth, veritas, hakika. I wonder why hakika is there, by the way, because that's not a substantive. typically refers to a property. The property that a proposition, statement, or belief has when it corresponds to or adequately represents reality. It is an abstract noun picking out something general, whereas the true, to elethes in Greek or verum in Latin, is often used to pick out that which has the property of truth. It is a substantive use referring to true things, true beings, or truth, as a transcendental feature of being itself. In scholastic Latin, verum as a transcendental is the true, a mode of being, not just a logical property of propositions. Now, gnomic sayings indeed, right? Now, even Claude makes mistakes. Al-Haq, in fact, is one of the names of God, not a way of referring to a property. Verum and elethes, even to elethes, maybe, are adjectives and apply to truth bearers, but say I, to elethes picks out the true thing, or a true, well, to the true thing, not the true, right? It does seem clear enough that the adjective true applies to truth bearers in virtue of their relation to the truth or to the true. But what may be the difference between talking about the truth and the true? Well, I'll leave that today for some discussion, I hope, and let me turn instead to some history. Okay, so according to Sextus Empiricus and Diogenes Laertius, the Stoics distinguished between the true thing, to elethes, and truth, aletheia. And here's what they say. Here's Sextus from the outlines. The true thing, to elethes, is said to differ from truth, aletheia, in three respects, namely in essence, in composition, and in power. The difference in essence, since the true is not a body, for it's a proposition, and thus a lecton. I think actually it should be axioma there, but rather than proposition, whereas truth is a body, or it is knowledge assertoric of all truths, and knowledge is the ruling part of the soul in a certain state, just as a fist is a hand in a certain state. And the ruling part is a body, for according to them, it is breath, right? You can look at that, right? Now, notice that what's going on here is that the Stoics are claiming that truth, aletheia, is a thing, right? It's a particular body. And it is a body in a certain state, I guess you'd want to say. Now, there's debate about whether this body is the ruling part of the universe as a whole, what the Stoics would sometimes call Zeus, the so-called hegemonicon of the universe, or whether it is the ruling part of a sage, if there be any sages, right? But notice that it's a body, and it's a particular kind of body because it consists of many true items of knowledge. So it's something like an organized neural system, you might think, right? Except that, of course, the universe doesn't have that. Okay, I'll leave that to sort of for you to think a little bit about. What do the Stoics actually think this is, right? It's a good question, I think. So for the Stoics, truth is a thing. It's the hegemonicon of someone, right? Either the sage or the universe. And it's a good question exactly what it is. For the Stoics, there's only one possible world and only one complete and coherent systems of truth. And the so-called hegemonicon, the ruling part, either, as I say, of the universe or of the sage, knowing this system, that hegemonicon is the truth, right? That's what it is. Now, although there's no obvious direct connection between the Stoics and the Gospel of John, although there's clearly some influence, this dovetails nicely with the claim that we find in John's Gospel that Christ, whom John describes as the Word of God, the Logos of God, said of himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? And you can see that in the Latin and the Greek, right? The Greek is halatheia, and the Latin is veritas, right? The abstract noun. And you can see, again, it's this thing that Christ is claiming to be, right? The truth, right? And just like the Stoic conception there. And thus we have two interconnected domains, interconnected but distinct, in which issues about the true and truth and the truth arise, right? The first suggests that the true is a central notion in semantics, having to do with what is sayable, right? Let me just go back to show you that for a second if I can here. Maybe it's impossible. The second, that truth or the true is central to metaphysics and theology, having to do with the highest or most fundamental being. And the combination of these two raises an issue which can be put this way. How could it be that, say, Christ is truth, veritas, and a sentence is something true, verum, say? Okay, well, this brings me to capital T, truth, right? Although the identification of Christ with truth is a significant issue in the Christian scriptures, it seems to be Augustine of Hippo who begins to develop it in a systematic manner. And very early in his soliloquies, he addresses God this way. He says, I invoke you, God, truth, in whom and by whom and through whom are true all things which are true. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Now, this seems to be a special case of the Platonic principle, as Peter King called it, that if S is T, some feature T, there's something T-ness through which S is T. And Augustine is more explicit about this in the passage I've got up there now, where he says, where this is a dialogue between reason, ratio, and Augustine, right? In which reason says, first of all, since truth, veritas, and true thing, verum, are two words, let's see whether it seems that two things are signified by these or only one. And Augustine says, well, they seem to be two. And he gives an example. He says, chastity is not the same thing as a chaste thing. And so I believe that truth is one thing, and what's called true is something else. And then reason says, which do you think is the more important? And Augustine readily says, well, I think chastity is. And why? Well, it's because things are chaste in virtue of their relation to chastity. Things are not chastity in virtue of their relation to chaste. Now, that's already taking a stand, of course. If you were a medieval or even a contemporary nominalist, you might say, no, no, no. Chastity is just another way of picking out the group of chaste things. But let's put that aside too for a second and just go on, right? So here the special case concerns truth. So if S is true, according to this principle, there's something, truth, through which it's true. Now, with this principle in hand, Augustine approaches Soliloquies 2:2, where he argues that there necessarily is truth. And he writes here, I hope I've got it up. Yep, here's his proof that necessarily there is truth. And I want you to think a little bit about this proof, right? He says, look, when it, namely the world, will have perished, if it's going to perish, will it not then be true that the world has perished? For as long as it's not true that the world has perished, it hasn't perished. There's a conflict there between the world having perished and it not being true that the world has perished. Augustine said, sure, I grant that. And Ratio says, and what about this then? Doesn't it seem to you that it's possible that something be true while there's no truth? And Augustine readily, immediately says, no way. And so Ratio says, well, therefore there will be truth even if the world were to perish. And Ratio, and Augustine goes on to say, well, I can't deny it. Okay, now here, he borrows but significantly extends a topos from early discussions of skepticism. to argue that there can't fail to be truth, because even if there were no other truth, there would be the truth that there is no other truth. And in his little treatise on the De Libero Arbitrio, on the freedom of judgment, or however you care to translate that, he argues for the existence of God by arguing that while some terms, for example, what colors we're seeing, or perhaps even what material objects we're encountering, depend on us, so that if we sensed or judged differently, those items would be different. There are others, for example, mathematical items, which we do not create but discover, and to which our judgments must conform to be correct. And that there are these higher items, he thinks shows there's something which is above us. And since these higher items are themselves eternally, immutably, and necessarily true, think mathematics, so must truth itself. And though Augustine merely gestures at this truth is somehow to be identified with God, right? So here's his argument. Nobody makes these judgments about themselves. Now, Augustine's argument that there necessarily is truth depends on the Platonic principle that if something has a certain feature, then there must be the feature in virtue of which it has it. But it depends also on the prefixability of T, right? The highly controversial principle that if X, then it's true that X. So there's the Platonic principle. If S is T, there's something like T-ness through which S is T. And there's the prefixability. If X, then it's true that X, where X is some kind of claim. And then the argument is, were the world to perish, it would be true that the world had perished. And if we grant the intuitiveness of PT, then it's true that the world would have perished were the world to have perished. And so we can conclude that even if the world were to have perished, there'd be a truth. So truth is not going to disappear. Okay, now, even if we grant, these two principles, however, the argument does face some difficulties. And these are difficulties of a sort that were pointed out by Duns Scotus and developed to some extent by John Buridan. The argument requires those two, right? The Platonic principle. Were the world to perish, it would be true that the world had perished. If we grant the prefixing of truth, if we grant PT, then it's true that the world would have perished were the world to have perished, and so we have to grant that there's a truth. Now, Duns Scotus, however, points out that it seems that it's true in our current situation, of a situation in which the world has perished, that it has perished. But the argument makes the quite different claim that it would be true in the situation in which the world has perished, that it has perished, right? So here's Scotus. And this is something I think Arthur Pryor pointed out once in a paper on truth. But look, so the claim, it looks like you're not going to be able to quite get the conclusion that there necessarily is truth unless you have an unusual theory of counterfactuals. Now, Scotus is, of course, supposing that if per impossibile there were nothing at all, there'd be no truth bearers, and so nothing which is true. And so the argument depends crucially on what the bearers of truth are. Now, Augustine's argument explicitly concludes that to suppose there's no truth is self-refuting. But Augustine uses it to conclude that there's a particular truth, and that it's God, or more precisely the Word of God, the second person of the Christian Trinity. And this raises the question whether Augustine thought there were any truths besides that one. And more generally, the question of the relation for him between truth, veritas, and an item that's true. And there are passages in which Augustine speaks of truths, plural, veritates, And some later writers, both medieval and more recent, have used these to argue that Augustine is a pluralist about truth. But the overwhelming impression Augustine gives, I think, is that he thinks truth is unique, that there's such a thing as the truth. He thinks that it's Christ, and while other things are true, they're not truths. For example, there's a passage in his little thing on the Psalms in which he says, look, the truth is one, by which holy truths are, by which holy souls are illuminated. The scriptural text on which he's commenting, by the way, is, for truths are decayed from among the sons of men. And the passage, I think, suggests that each of the many truths is a reflection in the soul of the one truth. Right? So it puts in play the thought that created truths are always connected with how things are reflected or represented, an idea which has a long subsequent history. Okay, now that Augustine thinks that truth is unique, I think seems very plausible, and whether he has an argument for that is another matter. However that may be, we can identify two central features of Augustine's conception of truth. One is that it's connected with normativity. A is higher than B if A settles how B ought to be, right? So our minds ought to believe that 2 + 2 is 4 because 2 + 2 is 4. That's why. Truth itself, capital T, is highest because it determines how lower things like minds and physical objects ought to be. So that's the first piece of his picture. The second is that at least this higher truth is unitary. And of course, Augustine is then prepared to draw the claim that it must be God, the highest thing, right? But whatever you think the highest thing is going to be, maybe, the Stoic hegemonicon of the universe, that will be the one thing. Now, it's Augustine who makes the identification of truth with this highest thing a topos in the Latin philosophical tradition. Augustine's not averse to identifying God with such items, as being and goodness, but it's Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy who focuses attention on the idea that God is goodness as well as being and unity, and so that the normativity that he ascribes to truth, that Augustine describes to truth, is a case in which the highest truth, the thing which is truth, is also the highest normative thing, it's goodness. And Anselm of Canterbury takes this on board and adds truth to Boethius's list of being and goodness, thus explicitly identifying goodness and truth. Okay, and here's Anselm in his little treatise on truth. Since we believe God to be truth, he says, and we say truth to be in many other things, I wish to, by the way, this is also as a dialogue, this time between a student and a teacher. I wish to know whether wherever there's said to be truth, we also should grant that it is God, i.e. the highest thing. The teacher says, unless I'm mistaken, we can identify truth as rightness perceptible only to the mind. This comes much later where they've gone through a whole bunch of things, some of which I'll come back to. And the teacher also adds, supreme truth, this is a little later again, existing in and of itself is not the truth of anything, but when something accords with supreme truth, then we speak of the truth or the rightness, the rectitudo of that thing, right? That's the language. Now, so notice we've got here a definition. We can define truth as rightness, perceptible only to the mind. Okay, now at the core of Anselm's theory is the claim that to be true is to have a sort of goodness he calls rightness, or some translators translate this as correctness, and in some other contexts, people will translate it as straightness, right? Rectitudo. God is goodness and is a standard to which other things must conform to be right, rectum, or true, vera. And to be true then is to be right or to have a rightness, and that's to conform in the appropriate way to goodness itself, which in Anselm's mind is God, right? So Anselm's official definition is that truth is rightness perceptible to the mind alone. He adds to the mind alone to distinguish the sort of rightness that's at stake from the straightness that a line might have. Now, I find this interesting. If you look at the way we use true now in English, we typically talk about true sentences, beliefs, maybe, propositions sometimes. But notice there are uses of truth in which we can apply them directly to ordinary objects. You know, that's a true diamond. That's not a fake, right? They're a true friend, you know, not a false one, right? And notice that doesn't automatically invoke any sort of linguistic or even perhaps mental item, unless you think ascribing true to diamonds somehow involves a mind. So Anselm is already moving somewhere here by adding this perceptible only to the mind and deliberately distinguishing it from the kind of truth that a line might have. And of course, we speak of, you know, say a carpenter or a builder as truing a door, right? That's a use where you actually make it straight in a certain sense. So something has gone on already by Anselm's time, and that's right the 11th, beginning of the 12th century, right? So, like Augustine, Anselm is not only concerned with beliefs or sentences, but his central concern is with the truth of actions, curiously enough, and agents, because in the De Veritate, the central text that he's concerned with is that text in John where the text has it said that the devil did not stand in the truth. That was why the devil fell. He did not stand in the truth. So my conclusion is that Anselm's core idea here is that truth is fundamentally a normative notion, a kind of rightness in its bearer. And he sets out to show this by considering the various cases in which we call things true. And he ends up paying more attention to sentences and beliefs than to other things, but he does not actually exclude other cases. So here's actions, for example. He says, unless I'm mistaken, we must use the same reasoning about truth in action that we used earlier to identify truth in other things. And the teacher says, you're right, for if doing evil and doing the truth are opposites, as the Lord indicates, then doing the truth is the same as doing good, since doing good and doing evil are contraries. Now, everyone agrees that those who do what they ought do good and act correctly. And again, notice the ambiguity, correctly. From this, it follows that to act correctly is to do the truth, since it's agreed that to do the truth is to do the good, and to do good is to act correctly. So nothing's more obvious than that the truth of action is its rectitude, right? Okay. Now, so far, there's very little in the story I've been telling which ties truth to language or to belief. Of course, as we saw, the Stoics did identify the true things, right, toelethes, with their mysterious axiomata, which they were at pains to insist did not exist, but subsisted. I mean, Stoic metaphysics of language or quasi-language is very mysterious, rather like the propositions that Bertrand Russell and others posited. But the accounts that we saw in Augustine and Anselm cast a much wider net. For them, it is things in general that are true, and linguistic items are not the only things in the story. So one might wonder, well, how did they become so? Right? How did we end up getting to the idea that, and here, by the way, is the argument, I think, that you see already in Anselm that things nonetheless are true insofar as they meet a standard for correctness, right? So that's the fundamental idea. Whatever can meet a standard of correctness is going to count as true. And again, that fits with the slightly archaic use that we have of, true friends, true diamonds, truing doors, etc. Okay, now, where did the emphasis on language really come from then? Well, already in Aristotle, we find something which seems to point that way. And let me just back up and say, if you read Heidegger's, say, 1943 paper on Plato on truth, you'll find Heidegger wanting to suggest that Plato actually makes the move towards what you might call internalizing truth by his theory of ideas. Now, I'm not inclined to buy that. Elsewhere, I tell a story about why not. But what does seem to be the case is that Aristotle does seem to emphasize the linguistic, or what you might call mental, side of truth, because he says to say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is and of what is not that it is not is true, right? And now Aristotle does introduce other senses of true. He talks about practical truth in Nicomachean Ethics 6. He talks about the truth of beings, but he emphasizes this one. And he moves easily between the concrete term, which in Latin is verum, in his it's aletheis, and the abstract term truth. So it's plausible to think of him as holding that a propositio or enunciatio, I've been working with the Latin text here, signifies truth or falsity. But as I say, he also still speaks of other sorts of truth. So he hasn't actually moved the whole way. And Boethius and others actually move a little further. So here's Boethius, for example, saying, a propositio is a bit of language signifying a true or a false, but notice still a true or a false thing or something. And notice that it's a true or a false, right? And in his second commentary on De Interpretatione, he uses the word enunciatio, which comes forth from you rather than propositio. And if you look at slightly later people like Apollonius, you get the same idea. Now, even Anselm, although he claims that everything is true, begins De Veritate with a chapter about affirmations and denials. He distinguishes between the truth of an item in virtue of which it's truly that thing, and its truth in virtue of which it fulfills a function that he has been assigned, and he claims that this kind of truth, the one that involves not just being the kind of thing you are, but also fulfilling a function that's been assigned to you, is something that you find only in actions or in claims. Right? So, see, a true diamond is just a diamond. Right? There's nothing more to be said, right? But a true sentence, now we can distinguish between being truly a sentence, green ideas sleep furiously. Well, it's got the syntactic form, but is it really a sentence making a claim? And if so, what possible claim could it be, right? Okay, so maybe it's a false qua sentence. It's not truly a sentence, even though it's got the syntactic form. But now 2 + 2 is 4. That both has the syntactic and maybe semantic form of a sentence, and it does something else. So here's Anselm, right? Certainly it's not customary to call a statement true when it signifies that what is not is. Nevertheless, it has a certain truth and rectitude in that it's doing what it ought to do. Given that it's 2 + 2 is 5, let's say, it ought to be saying something about 2 + 2 being 5, right? But when it signifies that what is, it's doing what it ought to in two ways, since it not only signifies what it received the power to signify, but also signifies in keeping with the purpose for which it was made. And then Anselm goes on to say, and of course we emphasize that second sense, not the first sense, but of course we have to admit that there is this first sense between, being truly a sentence or truly a claim and making a true claim, right? Now, for Anselm, something is true to the extent that it meets standards. And claims or sentences, let's say, have a twofold truth. So they have to meet two standards. And those standards are derived from truth, the highest truth, which is God according to him. Robert Grosseteste, writing a century later, an English guy writing at the beginning of the 13th century, underestimated but very important guy, who knew Anselm's work very well, begins his own treatise on truth by asking how it can be that given that truth is the highest thing, there are many truths. And the background to his worry is the Platonic principle, the thought that just as things are pale in virtue of having a paleness, so things are true in virtue of a truth. There are obviously many true sentences. The question then is, are they true in virtue of different truths, right? Grosseteste begins with a series of arguments, concluding that there must be many truths. And he then continues with arguments based on different definitions of truth found in the tradition. Here's one. Truth is that which is, right? That's what we've been focusing on so far. But Grosseteste also distinguishes a truth above the mind from the truth that's borne by these things we say, right? The enunciationes. And turning to the latter, he introduces the definition that he attributes to Aristotle. Truth is the being in the thing signified as speech has it, right? And he then goes on to say, this is a definition that some phrase as the adequatio of speech to the thing and of the thing to the intellect. And this becomes the kind of resonant definition of truth that we get through the later part of the Middle Ages. Now, it's a great puzzle where this definition came from. People claim that it came from a little treatise by Isaac Israeli called De Definitionibus. And if you look, say, at Claude, if you ask Claude or if you look on the internet, you'll find this repeated over and over again. But it's not there. He never uses that phrase, not once. And there's even a 1933 paper by a guy at the, Muckle who showed, went through a number of the manuscripts and showed that it's not there, and nobody's found it since. So where this came from is really an interesting question. But in any case, armed with this definition, Grosseteste argues that the most basic speech is inner speech, and that it is the highest form of this speech, which is, according to him, the word of God, right? The logos, that is itself the source of the adequation of things to it. And hence the word of God is, just like John's gospel has it, truth itself. And thus Grosseteste is thus able to integrate the various definitions of truth that he's canvassed. Right? He says, fundamentally, this is what I say, it's inner speech that's true, but one can speak of every being as true to the extent that it conforms to what the word of God has to say about it. And I could then conclude, Grosseteste is thus able to include Anselm's picture of truth as an essentially normative concept, namely the meeting of a standard, right? So he's able to continue even though he has this other conception. Now, the definition of truth as an adequatio of signs, whether spoken or mental, to things and of things to signs, sets the stage for restricting the notion of truth so that only signs are truth bearers. And I think that's where our picture now has come. And strangely, it seems to have been Aquinas who consolidates the picture that we find in Grosseteste. The truth is fundamentally a matter of a relation involving signs and what is signified. And I find this very puzzling. I've got to tell you, here's the text. And Aquinas, by the way, says it's in Isaac Israeli. So, but he obviously hadn't read it there because it's not there. So you get this picture, and I think this is strange because Aquinas does think of true as a transcendental term that applies to everything, not just to signs, but to diamonds and friends and all kinds of other things as well. Nonetheless, he defines truth in this way. So he thinks of true as like being and good as a transcendental term. He goes on to say, well, anything can be called good, but it can be called good because of its relation to appetite. And things can be called true, anything, because of its relation to the intellect. And things can be said to be because they just are, right? There's no obvious relation involved. But he does think that everything can meet, that those three terms and a couple of others, beautiful, he suggests, for example, can be applied to everything. Taking his cue from a remark of Aristotle's, that truth and falsity are not in things as good and evil are, but in the intellect, right? He insists that the hallmark of truth is that it involves a relation to the intellect, whereas the hallmark of goodness is that it involves a relation to appetite. So the stage is thus set for the erosion of the idea that there can be any bearers of truth other than items which could be or could express knowledge or belief. The evolution is rapid. And by the early 14th century, we find it assumed by the great arts master John Buridan, for example, and others, that only propositions, propositiones, which we might better translate as sentences, can be true or false. But if only propositiones are true items, then what of the unity of truth and the connection between truth and God, right? After all, wasn't that an important part of that whole earlier stuff? Well, enter Robert Holcott, an early 14th century English theorist, who, as Paul Spade pointed out in a quadlibetal question on whether God is able to know more than he does know, Holcott writes, now, here's what he writes. I maintain for the present that the object known, believed, or opined is a complex and not a signified thing. For the locution, I know a stone, right, or I know wood, is not usually accepted among philosophers. You might wonder if there are counterexamples. But rather, I know that a stone is hard, or I know that wood is soft, and so on. And likewise, among Catholic theologians, I believe God is not a proper locution, or I believe God to exist. Now, that's curious because the creeds have it, I believe in God, right? Not I believe that God exists. But anyway, that's Holcott. Or I believe God to be three in one, and so on. And all this I understand with respect to our knowledge. So on the other hand, I say that not only a complex is true, for God is true, and is a true cognition equivalent and prior to every true complex. And hence, by knowing himself, God knows everything that's true, and he knows as well, for all true sentences that would be true if they existed, what they would denote. Yet neither do I say that every thing is true, properly speaking, about what's true, but rather only that a thing is equivalent in signifying to some form complex. And perhaps only the divine essence is like this by nature, and nevertheless by convention, anything whatever that's under the power of man, notice now, anything whatever that's under the power of man can be instituted to signify equivalently something true, if it pleases men to use it so. And so he gives this thing here, right? So, for instance, we see that a barrel hoop of a certain material signifies as much as would the sentence, there's wine in the cellar written on the wall. And hence this barrel hoop is true, could be conceded since the case is as is signified by it. The barrel hoops got it right? So here Holcott insists on two ideas. One is that only something which can signify how things are and not just what they are can be a true item. And the second is that a thing not in itself complex can so signify, and therefore that God is, and thus it seems God is true. Now, these ideas are made more explicit in the late 13th and early 14th century thinker Peter Valiaco, who claims explicitly that there's nothing true or there's no truth outside the soul in addition to every created and uncreated sentence. And just as God is an uncreated truth, so God is an uncreated sentence. Right? So notice the conclusion. If you're going to buy the claim that truths then have to be propositional in character, you end up saying that barrel hoops and God are sentences, right? That's the claim. Now, I've argued elsewhere, but I haven't time to argue here, that later medieval thinkers such as John Buridan make being true the default condition of a sentence, taking it to be true that unless there's some reason to think it's not true. So, for example, you see written on a board, this sentence is true. Now, Buridan would say, unless you've got a reason to think that's false, ascribe it true. And this is crucial to his solution of the liar, which I'd be glad to talk about. But this fits nicely, I think, though, if not decisively, with the thought that there's an object, perhaps God, which is the truth, and which it's the task of a sentence to reflect it. Now, medieval thinkers agree in maintaining that what there is determined by the highest thing, for them God, and not the other way round. And if God is identified with truth, then on such a picture, truth is prior to created being. And it's no wonder that there are true items, we might even call them small t truths, which are not made to be true by anything except truth itself. Now, let me finish with this. This dovetails nicely with a controversial claim of Gottlob Frege's, namely, that true sentences are names of the true. Right? Frege was skeptical of the idea that truth is a property, partly on the grounds that he didn't see is true functioning as a predicate. This was because, as a precursor to the idea that truth doesn't add anything, he didn't think that adding is true to a sentence adds any content to it. If I say 2 + 2 is 4, and I go on to say 2 + 2 is 4 is true, then I haven't given you any more information than I did it the first time. Unlike the redundancy theory, though, Frege did not want to deny the reality of truth, and instead insisted that we treat truth as an object. That is, to be precise, he suggested that we treat the truth values, true and false, as objects. I haven't come to that issue, and I won't. The idea is that we treat whole sentences as singular terms, and as singular terms refer to objects, whole sentences will refer to objects. The reference of sentences are the true and the false, with the true sentences referring to the true and the false sentences referring to the false. And here's Frege's argument, right? Or at least one version of it. He seems to have thought that in a sentence such as that 2 + 2 is 4 is true, that 2 + 2 is 4 is a term, and so it must pick out something. And so must that 2 + 2 is 4 is true in the sentence that 2 + 4 is true. Okay? Now, since the reference of a whole is a function of the reference of its parts, substituting one part with a given reference for another with a different reference should change the reference of the whole. But if I substitute that 3 + 3 is 6 for that 2 + 2 is 4 in B, it doesn't change the truth value at all, right? So, and so A and C then must have the same referent namely the truth, right? And so truth is unitary, just as one might have thought. Now, I very much doubt that Frege had anything like God or the medieval story I've tried to trace in mind when he insisted that every true item refers to the true, but his picture dovetails nicely with it. And that's the truth, if far from the whole truth. Yeah.